Thank you for joining us once again in this series called Unbundling 101, incorporating unbundled legal services into your practice. This segment is about engagement agreements, and I'm once again joined by my lovely colleague, Elise Jones. Let's go ahead and get started. Step number one, of course, is to make sure that your agreement is in writing. This is obviously a best practice regardless of whether or not you are offering full scope or limited scope services. But if you're offering unbundled services, your state's rules governing unbundled services may in fact require you to ensure that the engagement agreement is in writing. Regardless, take this one tip away, get it in writing. Defining the scope of the engagement is probably going to be the most important paragraph of your engagement agreement. And you want to be incredibly specific about what is included in your scope for limited scope services. You're going to outline every single thing that you're going to do for the client that's included in the fee that you're quoting, and when you're going to begin the work and when the work is going to terminate. I personally get incredibly specific in my engagement agreements down to the exact title of the documents that I'm going to be drafting or reviewing, and anything that I anticipate that is not going to be part of that. The more clarity that you can include in the engagement agreement, the more clarity the client is going to have about who and what each person is doing, and most importantly, what you are not doing for the client. If the potential client has chosen limited scope or unbundled services, make sure that you have a list of tasks to be completed during the scope of representation, including tasks that you may or may not be providing for them, so that the client is on notice that there's going to be things that he or she may have to do individually or on their own. This is imperative. If you know that there's going to be a task in the matter that you are not going to be including in your scope of work. So, for instance, if the client is going to have to complete a financial affidavit, which is something that is routine in each and every family law case that I do, I'm going to make sure the client knows that's coming down the pipeline and you're going to be responsible for it. Again, we've talked about the CBF and JEP limited scope representation toolkit. That is an awesome, awesome resource. And on this screen, you can see there's a screenshot from that toolkit that includes a sample checklist for you to be working from when you're drafting your engagement agreements. There's also sample engagement agreements and other important information pertaining to unbundling or limiting the scope of your services in that toolkit. So make sure you take a peek.
Just to add some additional tips to what Roya has just described. I know as attorneys, we tend to have a tendency to want to help. Most clients come to us to solve a problem. So it's important keeping in mind with what your representation offers when you're doing limited scope and offering unbundling services. You always want to discuss any changes regarding the scope of your representation. That way, you're setting the boundaries for your client and you're also setting the boundaries for yourself and covering any task that the client may or may not have thought was in the engagement agreement. If you are going to offer additional services, you want to make sure that you provide a separate engagement agreement or an addendum to the original engagement agreement, just outlining what the changes in the scope of work or representation is, or the additional tasks that you may be including. This, again, is a very important area when you're offering additional services to clients that are outside the scope of the initial engagement agreement. This also prevents any sort of ethical challenges that you may have in the future. And you've reached the end of this segment. So the next segment in this series is going to focus on additional tips and resources to help you get started, and it's titled Tips and Resources. Thanks for joining.